Hello, hi. Thank you, Emily. So my name is James Porteus. I am an area ranger with the National Trust based on the Northumberland Coast. So our offices are at Low Newton by the Sea. That's my office, so it's not a bad place to work. And yeah, I'm going to talk to you today about the shorebirds of the Long Nanny. So if anybody doesn't know where the Long Nanny is, I will explain in a minute. So just before I do talk about that, just a little bit about me. I won't bore you too much with my story, but I have had a bit of an interesting route into conservation. So I started off studying mathematics at Durham. After I graduated, I got a graduate job in London in finance. And after a couple of years of just, sort of working in finance and not hugely enjoying it, I decided I wanted to change. My wife is from Northumberland, so we decided we wanted to move up to Northumberland to be closer to her family. And I thought I would have a bit of a career change. And I applied for a job with the National Trust with no real expectation of getting it. Honestly, at the time, I didn't have any experience really, any great knowledge. I just loved being outside. And fortunately, somebody decided that they would take a bit of a chance on me and gave me a job. And I suppose the rest is history, really. I've been with the National Trust now for coming up to 7 years. I've had some great experiences. So there's a few photographs of me doing various roles. My first job was the one that Emily's just said she did this summer, working for the National Trust, protecting the terns in Beadnell Bay. I've done a year working out on the Farne Islands. I've gone down to Cornwall and done a stint with the National Trust on the North Cornwall coast as well. And now I'm based permanently out of Low Newton, looking after 11 miles of coastline from Durridge Bay up to Lindisfarne. We've got 11 miles interspersed along that section. It's a fantastic bit of coast. So I've had some amazing nature experiences. There's sort of the obligatory photograph that anybody that's worked on the Farne Islands has to get with an Arctic tern sat on their head. And this was during the autumn when I was on the Farne Islands, one of the seal pups. I'm very, very lucky that I have had some incredible experiences and some very kind of intimate encounters with nature. Maybe sometimes a little bit too intimate. That was a puffin that obviously didn't realise that the toilet was occupied. Anyway, that's enough about me. So the Long Nanny, I don't know whether anybody visited. If you haven't, I would absolutely encourage you to visit next summer. The Long Nanny is a small river which flows into the sea in Beadnell Bay. So on the left there you can sort of get a feel of how far north we are. So we're just south of Bamburgh and Sea Houses in the Northumberland Coast. The nesting colony at Long Nanny is right in the middle of Beadnell Bay. So on the right hand side here we've got the map. Beadnell at the north end of the bay, Low Newton at the south end. So we've got a nesting area which we rope off every summer, which is roughly 1 mile in perimeter. It's about 13 hectares in area. So it's a large area that we give over to nature every summer. And it's a huge undertaking with volunteers and staff to rope off that nesting area to restrict public access. There are 3 species of birds which breed at the Long Nanny Reserve. So we've got Arctic terns on the left there, which are very distinctive with their blood red bill and black cap. In the middle, little terns, which are the second rarest breeding seabird in Britain. And on the right is ringed plover. So they're the 3 species that breed at the Long Nanny. So a bit about the work that we do. Here's some photographs of the site. So we employ 6 seasonal rangers every summer, and they will come and work 24 hours a day for 3 months of the year, from May through to the end of July. We've got very basic facilities, but they actually live on site to carry out all of their duties. So we've got the what we call the tern hut, or the ranger's hut on the left there. Top right is inside that wooden hut, and that is home was home for Emily for 3 months this summer. It is very basic inside. We've got a fridge, freezer, and a cooker, which is hooked up to Calagas, and we've got a solar panel outside, and that is their sort of sitting room and kitchen. And then the bedrooms are tents, which you can see in the bottom right, and then we have 2 toilet huts, rather basic. But an amazing place to work, an amazing place to spend the summer. So there's a whole pile of infrastructure and work that goes into protecting the reserve. So on the left-hand side, you can see some of the rope fencing that we put up. So you can see all the Arctic terns in the air there. So we actually have 3 different layers of rope fencing. We've got the closest into the dune edge. We put up a net fencing, which keeps dogs and sort of larger land predators like foxes and badgers out of the nesting colony. And then we have two layers of rope fencing. And it's just to provide a really visible boundary to walkers and people to try and prevent recreational disturbance. We then have lots of signage which goes up right across the beach. So the sign on the top right there is right at the far end of the bay. We put signs up at the entry points to the beach, and we've created sort of little touch points again along the beach there in the bottom right there. We found that's really useful. We've got a leaflet dispenser and somewhere people can sit and just enjoy. And it's all part of the wider aim to try and engage people and let people enjoy the area. And just a few more photographs as well. Got a bird hide on the top left, which again is, I mean, I can only just fit in it. It's tiny. And some more of our signage and fencing. So it's just a zoomed in picture there, so you can see the reserve. So this is where the rangers live. That's where the wooden hut is and the tents. And then the birds actually nest all around this area here. But we rope off, so everything in that hashed area is all no public access. And I think really it's a real win actually for nature conservation. There's not very many areas along the Northumberland coast which are completely given over to nature, where there is no public access. So to have an area that's 13 hectares where there's no people for 3 months of the year, obviously it's a hugely significant site, but even so it's really significant to have no people going in there. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the species that breed at the Long Nanny. So firstly, the little tern. So as I mentioned before, the little tern is the second rarest breeding seabird in Britain. It's very distinctive. It's got the black bandit stripe across the eye, the sort of orangey yellow bill with the black tip, and it's much smaller than all of the other breeding terns that we've got in the UK. So there's 5 species of tern which breed in this country: Arctic and common tern, sandwich tern, roseate tern, and little tern. And this is significantly smaller. It weighs about the same as a tennis ball, and it's at least sort of 2/3 the size of the next biggest tern. It's on the amber list for the British Birds of Conservation Concern, and it is declining. So there's currently estimated to be sort of 1,300 to 1,400 breeding pairs in the country, and at the Long Nanny we have typically about 2% of the national breeding population. Obviously numbers fluctuate year to year, but normally about 2%, which is generally in the region of 30 to 40 breeding pairs. So in the UK, little terns typically breed, well, almost entirely breed in coastal locations. On the continent, they breed on the continent, they do much better. They breed on estuaries and rivers, little islands and sort of on rivers. Whereas in the UK, in coastal locations, they're breeding at very low elevations, often very close to the high tide mark, which puts them in conflict with, often with people on busy beaches like in Beadnell Bay, and also with the tides. So when we get big spring tides, their nests are often in danger of being washed out. And it is interesting, like I say, that in other parts of their range that they don't tend to breed in these areas. So whether it's something to do with a lack of suitable breeding habitat in this country, I'm not sure. But virtually all of the nesting locations in the UK are in places like the Long Nanny, on the coast at sort of low elevations. Oops, I'll go back one. So it's difficult to find an exact date for when little terns started nesting at the Long Nanny. I did find this. So I've just taken an excerpt from this. It's a book which was written by one of the previous National Trust wardens. So this says that probably little terns started nesting at Long Nanny in the 1950s, and there was sort of 12 to 10 pairs annually. Then in 1977, the National Trust established a protection scheme. So the National Trust has been managing the Long Nanny since 1977. And I think you'll see in a minute how the National Trust taking on management and conservation of that site has really positively impacted the number of pairs. So sorry, I tried not to put many graphs in because I know they're not always very exciting, but I have put a few in. This is my first one. So this is looking at little tern breeding data at the Long Nanny. So the National Trust's data goes back to 1980. So on the far left it's the 1980, far right is 2024. The black line is the number of breeding pairs, and the yellow line is the number of chicks fledged each year. So you can see in 1980 there were actually very few. There were only 3 pairs of little terns in 1980. So actually back in the 50s when the little terns started breeding there were more, but it dropped to 3 pairs. And then the National Trust took on management, started roping off areas of the beach to reduce human disturbance and also to control predators. And you can see over the next sort of decade, that black line, the number of pairs, increases quite sharply up to the peak, which is in the mid-1990s. There were 57 pairs in the mid-90s, and that's the highest we've ever had. And then it's kind of flatlined. It's maybe a little bit lower in recent years. And recently, we would sort of expect anywhere between 30 and 40 breeding pairs. You see, it does fluctuate from year to year. This year, in 2024, we had 25 breeding pairs. I think the yellow line is really quite interesting. You can see how the fortunes change drastically from year to year. So that's the chicks fledged. So some years, I mean, even in the very recent past, we've had some exceptional years where we've had over 50 chicks fledging. But you can see that just having one good year, the next year we've had some really poor years where you can even have 0 chicks fledging. And their fortunes year to year depend on factors like the weather, so whether we get big tides which are washing out nests, how active predators are, the amount of human disturbance, all of these different challenges that they face. And you can see how much that breeding success fluctuates. So just on the left, actually, I thought it would be interesting just to show you, these highlight all of the little tern colonies across the country. And this map actually is taken from the Seabird Census 2000, so it is out of date slightly now, but it's the most recent one I could find. You can see little terns tend to nest, the largest sort of concentration of breeding colonies for little terns is in the East Anglia kind of area, southeast England. There are other colonies interspersed, so there's some down in Dorset and Hampshire and some on the west coast. In northeast England, we don't have that many, and this is definitely out of date now because, so you can see this, the largest red blob there would have been the Long Nanny, and just above that there's a small red one, which is Lindisfarne National Nature Reserve, and then there's also some colonies down in Teesside, so Crimden Dean, St Carew. Now, if you were to do this map again, the Long Nanny dot would be smaller, and the Lindisfarne and Crimden Dean colonies would be bigger. They've actually got more pairs than we have now, but there still are only 3 little tern nesting colonies in northeast England, and East Anglia is still the biggest concentration of little terns in the country. This graph on the right-hand side, I think, just illustrates the difficulties that they're facing and the declines. So on the far left there, 1986, there were about 2,500 breeding pairs, and this is an abundance index, so it's comparing the population size to the 1986 figure. So if you fast forward all the way along to 2019, we're at roughly 58% of the population that there was in 1986, which is roughly 1,400 breeding pairs. You can see that that line is definitely heading in the wrong direction. And possibly the reason for this, this graph is looking at productivity. So the productivity is the number of chicks fledged per breeding pair. So for example, if you had 20 breeding pairs and they fledged 20 chicks, you'd have a productivity of 1. So there's something called the population fertility rate. So that is the productivity which is sort of required for that population to be maintained, to stay stable. And for little terns, the population fertility rate is roughly 0.63. If you average out the productivity at the Long Nanny over the last 40 odd years, it averages out at about 0.55. So even though we're having some really good years, we're also having some very poor years, and the productivity rate is not quite enough to maintain that population level, and it is starting to decline. Obviously, there are other colonies in the region, and birds move between colonies, so there's more going on than just this, but this will be being played out at other colonies across the country as well. Right, Arctic terns. So the Long Nanny, not many people know this, is the largest mainland breeding colony of Arctic terns in the whole country. Most Arctic tern breeding colonies are further north than we are, and sort of in the Northern Isles and the Western Isles of Scotland. So although there are bigger colonies in the UK, we're the largest mainland breeding colony. So there are roughly 53,000 breeding pairs in the UK. This year at Long Nanny we had just over 1,000 breeding pairs, but we've had much more than that in the past. So when I first started working for the National Trust in 2018, we had closer to 3,000. I think it was 2,800 and something breeding pairs. So it was indisputably the biggest mainland breeding colony at that point. So I don't know whether people know or not, but recently, just earlier this year, actually in September, Arctic terns were added to the Birds of Conservation Concern Red List. So they really are struggling at the moment. They're in long-term decline. So I think the work that we're doing to conserve them at the Long Nanny is really, really important. So these pictures are really just to give you a bit of a sense of how many birds there are. It really is a wildlife spectacle. It's an amazing place. I think it's quite easy to go, and you'll look across the beach when all the birds are settled, and you think, oh, there's not actually much there. But then you'll get a predator come through, or a walker or photographer goes too close, and it flushes all the birds up, and you get a real sense for how many individuals there are. And like I say, this year we had 1,080 breeding pairs, so over 2,000 individual birds, which certainly in recent years that's not that many for the Long Nanny, but even so, it's still an incredible sight. So Arctic terns are famous for having the longest migration of any bird species in the whole world. So they get their name Arctic terns because they breed in the Arctic regions. So we are at the sort of most southerly extent of their breeding range. There's a lot of birds which breed further north, like I say, up into the Northern Isles, up into Scandinavia, Iceland. So we're right at the southern end of their breeding range. And then come the end of the breeding season, they'll migrate south, and they migrate all the way to Antarctica, which is incredible. And there's sort of three main routes that they'll take. So all the birds will leave us, and they'll go down sort of the west coast of Europe, across the Straits of Gibraltar, and down the west coast of Africa. Some birds at that point will branch off, head across the Atlantic, and head down the eastern coast of South America, whereas other birds continue along the west coast of Africa down to the Cape. And again, there's another bit of a fracture at that point, where some birds will continue south, and other birds head out into the Indian Ocean, all the way, in some instances, right across to sort of Australia and New Zealand before they head south. A lot of birds spend a lot of time in the Weddell Sea over the winter, which is this area here, feeding before they head back north. And I find it amazing, like with a lot of birds, they come back to the same nest sites year on year. We do ring birds. When I was on the Farne Islands, we fitted satellite tags onto some of the Arctic terns there. And we ringed a bird which took this, so we were able to see the migration route that it took as well from the data that came back. And it took this migration route down through the Indian Ocean, and it was ringed as a chick just outside of the chapel in a farm, and it came back and nested a couple of years later in exactly the same location, just within a few metres, which I think is incredible. Oops. So similar sort of graphs, just to give you an idea of the population size of Arctic terns at the tern sites at Long Nanny. So again, this shows on the far left-hand side is 1980, and on the right is 2024. So this, I think, demonstrates the importance and the effectiveness of roping off an area and completely prohibiting public access, and the benefits that it can have on wildlife. So in 1980, we didn't have any Arctic terns nesting. At that point, we had 3 pairs of little terns, and National Trust had just implemented protection measures. And then over years of summers of people not going into that nesting area, Arctic terns started to arrive, initially in very low numbers, but then as the years went on, they started to come in more and more numbers, and it has grown, like I say, to be the largest mainland breeding colony in the country. And okay, maybe it's not entirely down to that, but I'm sure that excluding people during the breeding season plays a huge part in that. So again, the black line is the number of pairs, the red line is the number of chicks fledged. So the number of pairs peaked quite recently in 2018 when there was 2,800 breeding pairs. And that big decline after that, we had an avian botulism outbreak which killed well over 1,000 individual birds. So we saw a huge drop-off. And then we're just starting to pick up again. And of course, then we had avian flu as well. But actually, we were really encouraged this year to see 1,080 pairs returning. So we had that. So we were just building back up to here. Then we had it. So we had highest number ever. Then we had avian botulism, and it plummeted. Then we started to build back up. Then we had avian flu, and it's dropped off again. But we're pleased that it's only dropped off to there and not down here, which we feared it might do. Again, like with the little terns, the red line for chicks fledged, you can see the huge sort of ups and downs that we have. You can have some incredible years, but also you can have some really, really poor years. And it's very, it's very difficult. We do our best, but I think sometimes, it's just destined to be a bad year if you have terrible weather or if you have particularly hungry fox or whatever it is that's contributing to the failure. Again, the same sort of map. So that's just to demonstrate on the left. These are all of the breeding sites in the UK, again taken from the Seabird Census 2000. Just demonstrates, again, that we're at the most southerly extent of their range. So most of the nesting colonies in the UK are further north than we are. So again, in the west, and you can see, again, most of them are on islands, on the Western Isles and the Northern Isles. But I think what's really, I really wanted to highlight here was the importance of Northumberland in an English context for Arctic terns. So if you look in England, there's barely any red dots, are there, where there are Arctic tern breeding colonies. And this table here on the right, I suppose if you look at this, you can look at any of the columns, but if you look at the right-hand column, taken from, again, the Seabird Census 2000, it's saying that in England, the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands, there were 3,600 breeding pairs of Arctic terns, and 3,559 of those were in Northumberland. So we're so important in an English context, Northumberland, for the species. And these 3 dots in Northumberland, the southerly one is Coquet Island, and the middle one, Long Nanny, and the most northerly is the Farne Islands. Sometimes referred to as the Holy Trinity for Arctic terns. They're extremely important place for the species. So the final species, which I think sometimes is possibly overlooked, is ringed plover. So there are roughly 5,500 breeding pairs of ringed plover in the UK. In Northumberland, we have roughly 40 to 50 breeding pairs on the Northumberland coast. Again, this is a bird which is on the Birds of Conservation Concern red list and is in really steep decline. They're not doing well at all. And there's numerous conservation organisations in Northumberland which have projects aimed at protecting ringed plover and creating nest protection areas along the coast. At the Long Nanny, we've got a really important population regionally. So, like I say, there's only sort of 40 to 50 breeding pairs in the whole county, and we get anywhere between sort of 10 to 20 pairs each year nesting just in our very small little 13-hectare area. So we're probably the densest breeding population in the county of ringed plover at Long Nanny. The other big area where there's ringed plover is Lindisfarne National Nature Reserve, but that's a much bigger area, so they're more spread out there. So we don't have data going back quite as far for ringed plover. I'm sure it's there somewhere, but it's hard to find. So this just goes back sort of over the last decade, showing the number of breeding pairs. So this year we had 10 breeding pairs, and we fledged 23 chicks, so a really good year. Numbers fluctuate, but like I say, it's sort of anywhere between, we would expect sort of 10 to 15 breeding pairs going off the last few years. So there's various measures that we take to protect ring plover. This is me at the start of this year putting a cage over a ring plover nest. So these nest cages are deployed to protect the nests at egg stage from predators. So, for example, crow and fox, I suppose, and maybe badger as well, are the main ones really that these cages are aimed at protecting the nests from. So the wire mesh is roughly 2-inch by 2-inch squares, and then we cut out an entrance hole which is about 6 inches tall by 4 inches across, which is big enough for an adult ring plover to get through, but theoretically not big enough for a crow or a gull to get through. And actually we found these have been quite effective over the last couple of years that we've been using them, particularly where birds are nesting early in the season. So when the Arctic terns are nesting, and we've got 1,000 or 2,000 Arctic terns on the beach, the ring plover benefit from the protection of the Arctic tern colony, because the Arctic terns are very aggressive and they'll mob and dive bomb predators, whereas ring plover can start nesting as early as March, so a couple of months before the Arctic terns arrive. So we'll deploy these nest cages at that point because the birds are much more vulnerable. So some of the other work that our ranger team carries out, so on the left-hand side I've just got a couple of pictures looking into the Arctic tern colony on the top left and the little tern colony bottom left. So our rangers monitor the birds, and we get a count for the population sizes of each species. You can see the bottom left there, we've got the numbered nest markers next to each nest. It's a difficult job trying to count thousands of bird nests. We have one day in the middle of the summer, typically about 3 weeks after the first eggs are discovered, and all of our rangers will transect through the entire colony and we'll count every single nest. We have pockets full of sort of kidney beans. We'll put a kidney bean in a nest we've counted to make sure we don't double count it, so it's to mark a nest we've counted. And it takes quite a long time as we walk through, but it's a pretty accurate way of doing it. The little tern nests, you can see on the bottom left where we put the numbered stakes out. We'll go out maybe every 4 days, weather permitting, through the season to check for new nests. So we'll observe remotely through a telescope or binoculars. We can see where birds are sitting and where we suspect they're a nest, and then we'll go out and physically do a check for eggs. If we find eggs, we'll put a numbered stake next to the nest and we'll record the clutch size, and then we can come back and continue to observe it from a distance. On the right-hand side, this is some Arctic tern habitat creation. So there's an area in the dunes where we cut the grass at the start of the season. It's only a relatively small area. It's about maybe sort of 30 to 40 metres in length and about 10 to 15 metres deep. But it attracts about 100 breeding pairs of Arctic terns. And it's right next to that wooden ranger hut. We've got a viewing platform for visitors, so you can get views of Arctic terns on the nest from sort of 5 to 10 metres away. It's a really great place to see the birds. That's a nice photograph at sunrise. We also carry out other habitat interventions. I just thought it would be interesting just to show you some aerial photographs. So we're working in a really dynamic and changing environment. So this image on the left, the aerial image, is taken from 1940. And you can see how different it is to the image on the right, taken in 2010. So the dune, this is an accreting sand dune system. The dune's growing out here. And even just in the last few years, so this is the same photograph here from 2010 on the left, and then this one's from 2023. I think I've got... So that black line is this. So you can see just in the last sort of 10 years how much dune has accreted there. One of the issues, or potential issues with this, is that the terns won't nest in the really dense vegetation. So as the dune grows out, the birds are nesting on the sand and around the dune edge. So the dune's growing out, it's pushing the birds further out onto the beach, which is putting them in the way of the tide more and more. And also, as the Arctic terns typically nest really close into the dune edge, and the little terns won't nest with the Arctic terns. The little terns form their own colony, and they're having to nest further and further out on the beach to to get away from the Arctic terns, and as the Arctic terns are getting pushed further out. So the little terns have their nests extremely vulnerable to tidal inundation from high tides. So we've been carrying out interventions on the beach to try and raise the sand level so that the little terns have an area to nest away from the dune, away from the Arctic terns, where their nests are going to be less vulnerable to tidal inundation. So this is, we've dug a whole pile of sort of tree material into the beach, sourced at a local wood, and then it's left in place for a few months over the winter, and all the strong winds will blow the sand around, and it should, in theory, the sand should accumulate around the material, and come the start of the breeding season, you've got an area of sand which is much higher locally, and terns can nest. So there's just a photograph of little terns actually using that area on the left-hand side. You might have to look quite hard to make them out, but there's a few pairs sat on the ground there. And actually we found, if you can see on this image on the right-hand side, that it forms a bit of an island. So as the tide comes in, that area is the last area to flood. So it is proving successful in providing suitable breeding habitat, which is above the mean high tide mark for little terns. What we've had to do previously, we still sometimes have to do, to protect little tern nests from the tide when it comes in, is raise the nests up off the ground onto fish boxes. So the process is that we get a fish box, we fill it with sand, and then we have to replicate the nest scrape as accurately as we possibly can on top of the fish box. And it's really important to do it accurately. If you get it slightly wrong, then the adult bird won't necessarily recognise the nest, and it could abandon. I mean, it could abandon anyway, because obviously you're interfering with the nest. But the more accurately you're able to recreate it, the better. So maintaining the same orientation of the eggs is really important, and then any adorning nest material like pebbles or shell fragments, you have to try and move them and put them in the same position. This has always been kind of a last resort, because the chances of nest abandonment after this are obviously higher than if we did nothing. So we would only ever really do this if the nest is located such that we're very confident that it is going to be washed out by the tide. It does typically, actually, it normally has sort of 80 to 90% return rate, so nests that are raised up onto fish boxes, about 80 to 90% of the time the birds will come back to incubate. Another job that our rangers do, collecting dead birds. Unfortunately, that's become a part of the role in the last couple of seasons. So this photograph was taken in 2023 when we had a quite serious outbreak of avian flu. On the left is the totals of all the different species that our rangers collected. So we didn't just collect terns, we collected any dead birds that we found within close proximity to the breeding colony. So I think the really stark one there is the Arctic tern chick figure of just over 1,000 chicks that died in 2023. Fortunately, though, this year we didn't have any fatalities which were attributable to avian flu. We did collect some dead birds. They were sent off to APHA, the Animal and Plant Health Agency, for testing, and none of them returned a positive test result, which is really good. Another one of our monitoring duties is monitoring for food provisioning and what species of fish are being brought in. I think Emily will probably be able to testify that this is not an easy job to do at all. So all of the monitoring is done remotely through binoculars and telescopes. There are three main sort of food sources. So you've got sand eels, clupids, and gadoids. So I've got some photographs here of birds bringing different types of fish in. So we're asking our rangers to identify these, not necessarily through photographs, but just with the split second as the bird comes in and feeds it to the chick, which is not easy, but we do our best. And obviously it's really important to get that kind of data. So, I mean, very recently, the British government implemented a sand eel fishing ban in English waters in the North Sea. So we're interested to see whether that is going to have a positive impact on the birds and how many sand eels that they're bringing in. And then, of course, there's also climate change, which is a big factor in food provisioning. So as sand eels, which are the main food source of not just terns, but virtually all of our seabirds, they're really quite vulnerable and susceptible to climate change. They're cold water loving species. So as the seas warm, they're being driven further north and further offshore, and potentially further out of reach of a lot of our seabirds, and especially terns, which feed in the very top of the water column. So they're not able to dive as deep to catch sand eels as they go deeper. there's a few more. These are some slightly different food or prey types that the terns bring in. So there's flatfish in the top left, pipefish, stickleback, squid, prawn. There's all sorts of things they bring in. But typically, if they're bringing in a greater variety of prey, that's not a good sign, because it means that their sort of predominant food source, sand eels, is not in good supply. Disturbance monitoring is a really big part of what we do, and also engagement to try and prevent a lot of these recreational disturbances from happening in the first place. You can't prevent everything, though, and this photograph was taken this summer. This was a plane that actually landed on the beach. And small aircrafts and microlights are becoming a much bigger problem for us in recent years. But a lot of the recreational disturbance that we do get, for example, dogs off the lead, photographers, walkers, our rangers do a fantastic job in, like I said, they're there 24 hours a day throughout the breeding season, and they engage with those people, and it makes a huge difference, I think, to the breeding success. Without them, the levels of disturbance would just be probably intolerable. And we also monitor for predators and also actively try and scare them away. So I've just got a few photographs of different types of predators we experience. So there's a fox in broad daylight, which they can be really destructive. Birds of prey, so there's a kestrel on the left-hand side there. I'm not sure actually what set them off on the right there, but you normally can get a sense from the type of response of what type of predator is. So the way that the birds are flushed there would indicate probably that was a bird of prey that set them off. There's a great skewer coming through, and that's a mustelid, I think probably a stoat based on the size of it. But when I say you can tell from the response of the birds what type of predator it is, you can see in this image on the left, so you can't see the stoats, but you can see the birds. They form a conical shape, we call it a dread, over the predator. So if they form that conical arrow shape, they're normally pointing you to the problem. So it could be a stoat, a weasel, a rat, a rabbit. Sometimes it can be. Sometimes they'll do that over injured birds as well, injured Arctic terns. But it's a good indication of where the predator is and what kind it is. So again, this is some data from the season before last. Our rangers recorded over 400 instances of predator disturbances. So this isn't just sightings, this is when a predator is actively disturbed or made a predation attempt on the colony. And then the final thing I just wanted to finish off with is something a bit out of the ordinary. So we've had, for the last 5 years, a visiting bird called an American black tern, which has summered at the Long Nanny colony. So this is a very rare bird. There's black tern it's not actually split into two species yet, but there's two different sort of variants. There's the European variant and the North American variant, and this particular bird is the North American type, and it's actually the first record of an adult American black tern in breeding plumage in Britain. And like I say, it first came over here 5 seasons ago, and every year since it's been coming back to Long Nanny. And it attracts a huge amount of interest. We've had so many people coming to see it. And then this year, it actually made a nesting attempt with an Arctic tern, which, as far as we know, is the first documented nesting attempt between an Arctic tern and an American black tern anywhere in the world, which was really quite amazing. So what was really interesting is this bird's been coming for the last 5 years, and there was actually a paper written about it by a local birder, and they made the assumption that this bird was a male. And the reason they assumed that, there was two main reasons. One was the fact that it was regularly seen displaying with fish, and it's assumed that only male terns do the displays with fish. And I can't remember what the second reason is now off the top of my head, but but the fact that it was displaying with fish, I think, was the main one. Anyway, this year, again, it was seen displaying with fish, but it actually, the nesting attempt, it laid the eggs. So we saw it mating as well, and when it was mating, the American black tern was on the bottom, and then we know that it laid the eggs as well. So we actually can prove that it's a female, which is really interesting, because in all of the literature about terns, it says that it's the males that display with the fish, but in this instance, we've got a female bird displaying with fish. And as I say, we know that it laid the eggs because we measured the eggs. So on the left there, they are the American black tern eggs. On the right, that is an Arctic tern nest at the Long Nanny. They're quite different, actually, the eggs. You can see obviously the scale isn't the same in both pictures, but they are significantly smaller. They're about half to two-thirds of the size. And they're lighter in colour and blotchier as well. So they're consistent. The dimensions of the eggs were consistent with American black tern eggs, which we found in the literature about American black terns. So there's a nice photograph again. Unfortunately, the eggs weren't viable, which isn't really that surprising. So these are they're from two different genus. So Arctic terns are sort of sea terns, and the American black tern is a marsh tern. So they're very, very different. So the chances of those eggs being fertile and being viable was low. For a long time, though, we suspected that they were, but after, I think, sort of 40 to 45 days, they were eventually abandoned, and we dissected the eggs and found that they hadn't developed. But what we did do is we've ringed both the American black tern and the Arctic tern that it was partnered with. So we've put colourings on both birds, and we're interested in a number of things, which we're hoping that this might help shed some light on. One is what migration route the American black tern takes, or where it goes over winter. Like I say, it's been coming back for the last 5 summers consecutively. Typically, American black terns they'll breed in northern North America and winter in northern South America. So is this bird going to winter with American black terns in South America, or is it maybe migrating with the Arctic terns down to Antarctica, or is it maybe doing something else? Who knows? But this might help. We're also interested to see for definite that it is definitely the same bird which is coming back to the Long Nanny year after year. I mean, the chances are very high. We assume that it is. But of course, we don't know that. It doesn't have necessarily any really distinguishing features. So we'll be able to confirm next year if it comes back that it is the same bird. And then the reason for bringing the Arctic tern was largely to see if the American black tern does come back next year and it pairs up with an Arctic tern, does it pair up with the same bird? Are we going to see fidelity between different species, which would be really interesting. So, yeah, we're really hoping that the bird turns up again next year and we might get at least answer to one of those questions. Yeah, we'll see. So that concludes my talk. It was about 45 minutes, so it wasn't too bad. Yeah, I'm more than happy to take any questions if anybody has any.